Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
As I've listened to your story, I thought that there might be some things you might be able to clarify for us that might help in terms of research. So they're going to be different subjects, but let's just touch on them. And let's go all the way back to Camp Barkley. We walked the ground a little bit in one of the battalion areas. We don't know which one it was, but you mentioned briefly a description of the hutments where you lived and the latrines and all of that. We've spotted a section of foundations just north of the motor pool that we visited this week that are definitely all latrines and that are in a row running north-south. Any barracks or hutments that were to the left or right of them or east or west are gone.
Because they probably just had pillars under them.
The pillars are gone because if the buildings were sold off, they probably would have taken the pillars with them. Do you remember anything about how those hutments were laid out in relation to the latrines?
As I remember it, the latrines were lined up, like you say, north and south, and the huts were, maybe not more than 20, 25 feet from them, and in our company, I think there was probably 3 rows of huts. 3 rows of those small huts to the, well, from where I'm looking, to the left of those for our company. Now, there were other ones over there, because we used to do close order drill in there, in between those buildings in the morning, do our calisthenics and then close order drill. And I remember about, all this stuff in there. I can picture them. The biggest thing, then of course, the huts would be up here and the latrines, and down across here would be the mess hall. The mess hall would be between us and the road. Now I've got a picture that was in either this month or last month's Hellcat News of D Company's huts. I had it in my article either in September, July, August, September, or November. I'm not sure which. And it showed the D Company emblem in front of their hutmans. And then of course the PX was across the road. I remember the PX being over on the other side, and the chapel was over there too.
Now, in relation to the parade ground.
But then the parade ground was farther over past the PX and the, because I can remember when they'd play retreat out there, if we were in our company area, it would be, well, I can point that way, but I'm not sure what I'm pointing south or what it was. But it was over the other side of the PX, the chapel, and of course in the mess hall was this side of the road. I could lay it out on paper pretty much the way they were, but I'm not sure of the directions.
Well, that might be helpful when you get back home to draw up plats, and maybe we could take that and look at the foundations that are still there, and maybe able to establish the orientation.
I got another man I'll talk to, Edwin Zimmerman. And before I send anything like that back, I'd send it to him, because he worked in our motor pool. And he was one of our mechanics, and he'd remember the motor pools pretty well. And maybe he could then give me an idea of how far it was from the motor pool back to the mess hall, or to the latrines and things like that.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Sergeant Schoper was our motor sergeant. I don't know whatever happened to him. He was from Louisville, and I talked about some of the men crying, back when we went back. Sergeant Schoper was a tech sergeant, and he was one of the cadre, the original people that was at West Point. We went there, and he really broke down at Hurlesheim. I mean, he knew we were getting really shellacked up there, and I don't know how he would have been if he'd have been up there. He might have been the same as the rest of us. But the fact that he was back here and couldn't do a damn thing about it, I guess, and went back, and he was crying just like a little baby. He'd been a real tough sergeant all those years, that I knew him. And it was strange to see, you'd think he would have been the guy out there cheering us on, but he would know, but I don't know what happened. In fact, he was from Louisville, Kentucky, and at one of our reunions in Louisville, I got on the phone and tried to call him, and I couldn't locate him. I'm trying to think who else was in our motor pool. I don't know, but I know Edwin Zimmerman, and he was in Virginia. I see Edwin, he's from Syracuse, New York. And I can, if I draw something up, I'll send it to him and ask him if he can tell me how was this located from the motor pool. Because I didn't work in the motor pool at Barclay, but at that time I was a tank crew member and didn't get into that. Back at Camp Campbell, I would know, because there for a while I did work in the motor pool. Okay. Yeah.
One other thing related to a tank battalion, you mentioned there was 109 men.
In a tank company.
How many tanks were?
In a tank company?
In fact, how many tanks and tank destroyers? In other words, how was that? What equipment did a company have?
In a medium tank, well, for instance, A, B, and C company were medium tank companies. They had 17 tanks each. They had 3 platoons of 5 tanks for each platoon, and then they had 2 headquarters tanks, which were one for the company commander and one for just an extra one for the headquarters platoon. So you had 17 tanks in a medium tank company. I'm not sure, and of course you had A, B, and C, so that'd be 51 tanks. D company was light tanks with the 37 millimeter on the turret, and I'm only guessing, but I assume they had the same number. I'm not sure about D company. But we used those, you know, in combat. We used those. 90% of what they did was carry wounded, evacuate the wounded. I talked to one man here, one man over here was talking today about how he spent 17 hours without anything, without stopping, just taking wounded out of Herlesheim. And that's what D Company did. And you had to give them a lot of credit because they were light-skinned, you know, those tanks. A 50 caliber machine gun would pierce them. And so when they went out there, they were even more vulnerable than we were. So, in a tank battalion, let's see, you had A, B, and C, that'd be 51, 61, 68, and then headquarters company had a few tanks. I'm not sure how many headquarters, but they had some with 105s on. Howitzers, 105s, and we could, you know, there were times when we set up as artillery. We, at one time, was it after Herlesheim? Between Herlesheim and Colmar, that's what we did. Well, it was one place we set up our tanks. We were trained here at Camp Barclay, and also, I think it was at Barclay. We were trained to set up, take 4 tanks, you'd set 4 tanks up in specific spots. You'd zero in their guns on it, what you call an aiming stick. So all the 4 guns are parallel, and then you could, from there, we had azimuth indicators in our tank turrets, so you would know just how far you were turning a gun, right or left, and then you could tell the elevation. And so one time Captain Clayton actually went up on one of the L4s, of course you've heard all about them, and he went up there and actually gave us fire. We hit a bunch of German horse-drawn artillery about 8 miles away from our tank guns. Of course, it had to be the 75s, not the 76s, because the 76s had too flat a trajectory, but the 75s weren't quite so flat, and that you could you know, throw them in as artillery. And we actually did, I think 3 or 4 days we sat there and just fired as artillery from fire orders we got back from the FOs up in the L4s. And so that was quite interesting. Of course, not every truck had, every company had, of course, 6x6, you know, trucks, and a few Jeeps. I'm not even sure how many Jeeps we had, but I know 17 tanks, 3 tanks of 5 platoons. In a tank platoon, you had a lieutenant, a second or first lieutenant as platoon leader, and each tank had a sergeant, only 3 stripes, as tank commander, and a staff sergeant as a platoon sergeant. And most of our platoon sergeants that were with us when we came overseas eventually became second lieutenants because they got battlefield commissions, because we lost lieutenants, you know, like pretty heavy. So I can name Jimmy, Pappy Shelton, Fred Shelton. Oh, we had one man who was a gunner, just like I was, a corporal. Just like that, he was a second lieutenant. He got promoted to a platoon leader overnight. Earl Cannon, his name was. And then it was Jimmy Phelps, And of course, Frank Pagnotta, who was our first sergeant, he got a battlefield commission, but he went to D Company. And so I think that's about the ones that got, battlefield commissions. And I'm trying to think what other equipment. Of course, every tank we started out with all 75s, and our main gun, the tank in the gun. But then as we got replacements, we got the 76s. The difference was that a 75, the muzzle velocity for a 75 was 1,900 feet per second. A 76 was 2,900 feet per second, which gave it a much flatter trajectory. And an 88 that the Germans had was 3,800 feet per second. So when we went into Nuremberg, there was a place there, 2 American tanks right in a row. An 88 hit the first one right in the front and went out the back and out in the front and out the back of the second tank. 2 tanks with 1 shot. And that's what the 88 could do. Well, our 76 was not quite that good, but it was. I hit a German tank one time at 1,800 yards, close to a mile, 1,800 yards, and I hit him 9 times before we considered him knocked out, because you didn't consider them knocked out until they start burning. And about the 4th shot, I saw something fly off, and it might have been a hatch, or something. And the 9th shot, they started burning, and that was it. And then I felt bad. I felt bad, I was glad I got him, but on the other hand, there was men in there,
What about other unusual kinds of equipment? Were they mostly related to
ours or theirs?
Yours.
Well,
like for example, recovery vehicles and things.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, most of those would be with the service company. Service company would have prime movers. A prime mover was a huge trailer that you could load a tank on and evacuate them. We did have, and I don't know how this came into the TO. We did it one time after we got across the Rhine River. We had a tank with a dozer blade on it. A dozer blade, and that was assigned to, I'm quite sure that was assigned to our, it was with our task force anyway, but I can't imagine which tank it would have been on. I think that must have been a service company tank too, though, because we went through a woods one time. There was a place where the Germans had cut down a lot of trees, and so we put the dozer tank up in the front and pushed all these trees out the way, and we went right on through. And we came through, here's a little German village, and we went through and we started to circle around this village. As we circled around, the German troops started streaming out the other side, running for the woods over on the other side, and it was terrible. We just mowed them down. We were on bicycles and running, and if that's war, it's not the kind of war I want to fight again.
They didn't stop and surrender.
No. I'll tell you, I would never fire at anybody who was trying to surrender. And I hate to think how many we knocked down here. Eventually we did stop our fire, but I mean we must have knocked down 150 of them anyway before we did. And as it turned out, this was some kind of a rear echelon ordnance outfit or something. There was a time we were going down the road and we were generally, the company commander's tank, we were generally the 3rd or 4th tank in line, because we'd have what we call a point. We'd have a platoon sergeant up on point, and he'd have 2 of his tanks, and then we might be the 3rd, and the rest of his platoon would be in behind. And the one time, I think it was Frank Scaglione, he called back and he says, there's a horse-drawn bunch of people up ahead of me. And Clayton said, right on through them. And when we got up there were horses that had been run over with, and they were struggling to get. We did stop and put some of them out of their misery. But here was paperwork and all. It must have been I don't know what kind of an outfit it was, but they had a lot of paperwork, headquarters unit or something, and the papers were all strewn all over the road. But these poor horses were. And some of them weren't wounded. We released some of them and just let them run. But there was, I think, half a dozen of them at least that we had to shoot to put them out of their misery. And that's war. That's the bad things about a war. There's good things about a war, I guess. Well, look at us. I wouldn't know all these guys if it hadn't been for the war. I wouldn't have some of the pride I have. I'm proud that I was a member of the 12th Armored Division, but there's nights I still wake up nights thinking about some of those things. But I guess down through the centuries we find that a lot of men wouldn't have no claim to fame at all if it hadn't been for war, And then on the other hand, you say, well, maybe if there hadn't been a war, God would have given, if these men were destined to be famous, they would have become famous some other way. I don't know. But I don't want to see another war. I don't want my kids to have to go to war. I don't want my grandchildren. But then on the other hand, if there was a war that we had to fight, I'd want my grandchildren to stand up and say, hey, count me in, I'll do my duty. But I hope it don't happen.
What about the role, now you've talked about the service company, now what about the 134th Ordnance? How did they sort of interface with you?
I'll tell you, the day that we lost our tank in Hurlesheim, we went back and they took Julian Head, Frank Bagley, and Jerry Theobald back to the Ordnance, and bingo, they had a new tank for them. They had a tank for them. They had it, and I went with Captain Clayton in another tank. When we came back that night, we had a brand new tank. This is what the Ordnance did. They had this equipment ready for us. If a tank was, then they hit, our own artillery hit our tank that we lost in the canal. They hit it with an 8-inch gun to destroy it because we had possibly left some papers in there that we didn't want the Germans to have. And I got a picture of that home. It don't look like a tank. Fred Field, our battalion commander, sent me the picture. He said, here's a picture of your tank there at Hurlesheim, where we hit it with artillery afterward to destroy it so there wouldn't be any, anything lost, any information. But the Ordnance was responsible for, well, as we moved ahead, if some of our tanks got knocked, well, for instance, that time that I almost rolled over the mountain, it was an ordnance truck that came along that hooked up a big winch to us to hold us up there, keep us from rolling down the mountain as we got out. But if you needed a new engine in the tank, if something like that, although I will say this, we had Ford V8 engines in our tanks, and I personally don't remember of anybody ever having an engine problem while we were in combat. Because for one reason, some of the tanks didn't last long enough. In combat, they'd get hit before that happened. But they were terrific engines. So, but if you needed a new engine, the Ordnance would do it. If you needed a new gun, now in this gun that I say where the mortar shell hit Sergeant White's tank, they did put a new gun, I understand, in that tank. The Ordnance did that. They went back there and one day they took the old gun out and put a new gun in and sent it back up. And we had it for another tank crew, the same tank. And that was Ordnance, 134th that would do that. Any major, what we might call third or fourth echelon maintenance would be done at Ordnance. First and second echelon maintenance you did in your own company motor pool, or your motor crew would do, like changing a track tread, or putting spark plugs in. But then again, we were only in combat, 5 months, so there wasn't many times we ever got around to changing spark plugs in combat, things like that. But if it had to be done, it would have been our own motor crew that would do it.
Well, define what you mean by first, second, third, fourth
Well,
echelon.
first echelon maintenance is normally done by the tank crew themselves to see that it's a tank that your tracks can get loose. You have a sprocket wheel in the front that drives the track. You have an idler wheel in the back that it just rolls on, and in between you have bogey wheels down on the bottom, and up on the top you have idler wheels that it rolls up on top. Now your tank, if your idler wheel slips a little, then your track would be loose, and there'd always be a possibility of throwing a track. So what you'd have to do then is get back and what we finally did in combat, or in the field, we'd take a half track, and that's true, our maintenance crew did have a half track too in our company. They had a half track. You would hook up to a lever on here, and you'd pull it with the half track and to tighten up, take the slack out of your tracks. Now that would be second echelon maintenance done by the company. First echelon is what the tank crew would do, like checking the oil, keeping the tank clean, keeping the clay and stuff out of the wheels. Anything that a driver would normally do to his own automobile would be first echelon. Second echelon would be more like tightening a track, or replacing a track, or overhauling an engine. Doing a real tune-up on an engine, spark plugs and things like that. That would be the motor crew. That would be second echelon. Third echelon would be like putting. Maybe fourth, I'm not sure, third or fourth would be like putting a new turret in a tank. They can take an old turret out if something was a hole through it and put a new one in, or putting a gun in, or even a transmission if they had to do it. That would be fourth echelon maintenance, I'm pretty sure. That would go back to, at least back to ordnance, our ordnance, division ordnance, and possibly maybe even to Army ordnance for a transmission, because the transmission on those tanks was completely across the front of the tank, was the whole front of the tank was the transmission, what they call a controlled differential. So I still, today in my work that I do different places now, I use these terms to people because I figure first echelon maintenance is what the operator is responsible for, and second echelon maintenance might be what the repair crew is responsible for, and third or fourth echelon maintenance is what you send it to back to the manufacturer for. But 134th Ordnance would be third and fourth echelon maintenance.
Service company would be second.
Yes, yeah. First would be first and second would be company, but first mostly the tank crew. Yeah, and taking care of your guns, of course, is first echelon maintenance. Keeping cleaning your guns and all that.
Another question I was thinking about as well. You did a good job of describing the crew in the tank. Give us a little sort of tour of where the ammunition is kept, how the engine is set up, and that kind of thing.
Okay, in our Sherman tank, starting at the front, all across the front is what I just said was a control differential. That's where, what you mean by a control differential is that by pulling on these levers that the driver uses, you can stop one side of the gear from turning and divert the power to the other side, or vice versa, depending
Like
which way you
tractor.
put. Yeah, that's right.
And
That's
brake on a tractor.
that's right. And then of course we had 4 speeds on the shift. You had a shift lever. Then your transmission ran right back alongside between the driver and the bow gunner. Now back on and the engine was in the far rear under the rear deck. And in our case it was a V8 Ford engines. They originally had been 12-cylinder engines built for aircraft, and they were all aluminum blocks originally. But then I guess they found that they didn't need them for airplanes, so they cut them down to 8 cylinders and made them, started making cast iron blocks out with them. Some of the first ones we got were still aluminum, but then they started coming through cast iron, and that was our V8 engine, 500 horsepower engine in the rear. We carried, if I remember right now, 180 gallons of gasoline. 2 gas tanks each on each side. The ammunition was underneath the turret. It actually went down in vertically, but then you had a ready rack up on the top, and there again, it's so long now, I don't know whether that held 8 or 10 rounds, but you could, and of course we had 2 different types of ammunition. We had armored piercing and HE. Now armored piercing was if you were firing an enemy armored vehicle like a tank, you'd use armored piercing. And some of it was what we, originally we had, in fact I got a shell home, one of the projectiles home yet from a 75, and that was solid steel. And my grandson thinks that's the greatest thing in the world. But then we got what we call armored piercing cap, and that was armored piercing, steel, pretty much steel, but it had a delayed explosion in it. It would penetrate a tank and then explode. So that was armored piercing cap. And then the HE would explode on contact. In other words, that would you'd fire if you were firing at enemy ground troops or light vehicles like trucks and things like that. And that was all stored under the turret. We'd always keep a couple of the armored piercing up the top, and 6 or 8 or 10, I don't remember exactly how many were in the ready rack. It would only take a short time. The minute, for instance, if the tank commander, we had what we call fire orders. Tank commander would say, gunner, alerting the gunner. Gunner, tank, that was a type of target. Traverse right, and the gunner would start traversing right. Steady, when he had a thing up there, look at, when you got close, you steady on, and then by that time the gunner should pick up this target, and he'd say, gunner, tank, shot. First he'd say shot, which would mean, or he'd say, that'd mean armored piercing. So that the assistant gunner would know what kind of ammunition to put in the gun. Then he'd say, traverse right, and when he got to steady on, he'd say 1-800, which would mean 1,800 yards, and he'd set your sight on that, and he'd say fire, and you'd fire. If you were short, he'd go up 1,000 yards, or if you're over, he'd come down 1,000. And then if you missed again, then he'd split the, we call that forming a bracket. And you'd bracket into it, you hit that target. Well, with the 75, which had the higher trajectory, you had to be pretty accurate as far as range went. But once we got to 76, which was much flatter trajectory, 500 yards, if you were shooting at a tank, less than 2,000 yards, it didn't make that much difference because the trajectory was so flat that it would, being up or down 100 yards or so didn't make that much difference. So I know this one tank that I got at one time at 1,800 yards, I hit him the first shot. And then after that, we just kept hitting them until he started burning. But, and then we also had on the side, over on the newer ones, the later tanks we got, we had a small mortar on the side, but this was for smoke. All we could fire out of that was smoke. In other words, if you were overpowered or something, you had to throw out a smoke screen to help infantry get, protect them from the enemy or fire or something. We could throw smoke out.
You ever use that much?
Not an awful lot. We did a couple of, one time, this town where we took a town, and that's the town where we found a German motorbike, and I put some gas in, I'm riding up and down the street, and Fred Field caught me. He took me back to Clayton, and he says, this man's been riding a civilian vehicle. I want the vehicle destroyed, and I want him to be disciplined. And Clayton said, yes, sir. So he walked away, and Clayton said, you heard that? He said, you've been disciplined. He said, get rid of that motorcycle. Well, I didn't destroy it. Destroy it, suppose you meant run over it with a towel. Well, I put it back into people's house. Because I figured, they were not, well, they didn't really let me use it, but, so I didn't, the bike went back. But anyway, the next town, we stayed in that town, and we did our first and second echelon maintenance. In other words, we changed the oils in our tank, and that's first echelon maintenance. And we, cleaned our guns, and we did all our first echelon, each tank crew did, and if you had any problems that the motor crew had to do, they did them. But we stayed there only, if I remember, just one night. And we'd been moving good. We'd been moving along, taking towns with no... So we started out the next morning. We had a platoon leader named Richard LaFrance. And we started into the next town, and it turned out it was a German OCS was there. German Officer Training School was there. And I don't know how they did it. The story we had, the Germans weren't supposed to have any white phosphorus. But they did. They fired white phosphorus. There might be some they captured from us or something. And some of it lit right on his tank, and he lost his eyesight. And he evacuated. Dick went out, Richard LaFrance, and he became a coach or a masseur or something for the Syracuse football team in Syracuse, New York. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not Syracuse, Cornell down in Ithaca. And I went out there and visited him a couple of times, shortly after the war. And but that was a case there where we used smoke that day. We threw smoke out to cover until we could get him out of there, there was a couple of other places we used it. I don't remember the specific times, but there was times when Clayton would say, lay down some smoke, and they did.
Carry much ammunition for that?
For the mortar?
Much smoke?
Gee, if I remember, I wouldn't say more than a dozen or so. Tell you the truth, right now I can't visualize what they even look like, because I was on the other side. That the assistant gunner took care of all that. Although I should have, but I never actually fired that little. It was just a little mortar. It was only, I don't think it was more than 3 inches in diameter. But and I'm trying to think what. Of course, we had the coaxial 30 caliber with the big gun, and we had the bow gun down here, and the 50 caliber. And the 50 caliber, I saw. We went into a woods near Ansbach, Germany one time, and there was an airfield there. And it seems like they must have taken all the Germans were, the war should have been over. And the Germans apparently took all the mechanics from the airfield, the ground crews and everything, and gave them rifles and said, get out there. And here we come with a lot of tanks coming through this woods. And we did lose a couple of tanks. A couple of tanks got hit with 88s, and it was an infantry lieutenant riding on our tank. And he was manning the 50 caliber machine gun. And I'm looking through my turret, and I saw a German get behind a tree, and the tree must have been this big around. He cut that right down with that 50 caliber machine gun. Cut the tree right in half, and the man right behind it. And because the 50 was really that was a weapon. And that was one day I was almost ashamed to be an American. I saw some things that day, but I'm not going to tell about it. I told my mother about it once, and she wouldn't believe me. But there's atrocities on both sides, you know, and this was the case where this one particular lieutenant shot a German for no reason at all. After the German had handed me a picture of his wife and daughter and said, "Look at this, my wife and daughter want to go home to him," this lieutenant shot him. Because he said there was no 88s there, see, and we knew there was. He said he didn't know, and this lieutenant shot him. And
anything happened to the lieutenant?
Not to my knowledge, no, unless he got evacuated for a mental reason, because I understand he was about off his rocker. And I'll tell you, I'm not going to say it. I came near to shooting him myself. I felt the urge, but I knew better. And that's the only real. Then, of course, you get down into places where I can't tell you this firsthand, but I know some of the fellows from A Company can tell you about Landsberg when they went into the concentration camp and saw some of the things in there where the ovens were still smoking and things like that. And
your company did not.
C Company, we didn't get in there. No, Colonel Field though, he had A Company in there, and I understand they saw some really terrible things. You know, the results of some of the killing of the prisoners, Jews or whatever they were, and it was. Of course, you've got some of the pictures here. And
did you see any civil prisons like some of the towns where you occupied? Did you have any experience with like civilian prisoners or prisoners of?
No, I actually didn't. When the war ended, we were almost into Austria, right on the Austrian border. You could look over and see the Alps and the Switzerland actually, and we stopped in this town. And I went in, and it was a place where a nursery like. There must have been 300 babies in this place. And the story was that they were orphans from German soldiers that had been killed. What they were, but I don't think that they were all under 5 years old. And I went in there, and you'd want to take them all and hug them, and you know, and they were, and I don't know what that was all about, but there was an awful lot of babies in this place.
Do you remember the name of the place?
No, offhand I don't. I could probably find it because I know just about where we were then on the map. But
what about slave labor camps or even POW camps, liberating those?
The only experience I had with that, we took Ansbach, which was another nice little town. And we actually, in the hospital there, we liberated some of our own 714th people were there in the hospital, in a German hospital. And when they went up to the hospital, they were liberated by us coming in there, and that's the closest I came to that. Now we do have, and there's people here that can tell you. I think maybe Earl Norris knows that there was one place where they went, and it was a woman's prison. It was all women, and some outfit had been in there, and of course it became to be a very obscene thing because these women were all wanted a man, and I guess they got involved, and so they took them out and they put A Company, I think A Company of our battalion in there, and the command was no physical contact, and some of the guys did, and some of the guys got broke for that, lost their stripes, and I know one fellow was just telling me yesterday, he says, you know, these guys fought all through the war, they were sergeants and everything else, and they got broke for that, and he says, Captain Lehman, I guess, was who broke them. But there was, you know, I guess that's going to happen.
Do you know the name of that camp?
No, I don't, but I could probably find out if Earl knows. But I've heard other people over the years talk about that. That was quite a place. Those women were willing to do anything to make the Americans happy. And I'm not sure of all, but certain ones, I guess. And I've heard that story down through the years, and I've heard enough of it to know that it must have been true. But I don't know how we missed all that, but somehow we must have been doing something else. Because we went to Augsburg, and we parked in Augsburg, and it was on the 15th of May. I know the date. 15th of May, 1945, we were in Augsburg. and we were guarding a school. And this school was full of French, what we called displaced persons, DPs. And there was gee, there were young girls in there, and it was, you know, and I did get kind of friendly with a girl there. I just got to know her, and I was what, 21 by then, I guess, and I'd still never had sex with a woman, and I never did until I got home, in fact, but I fell in love with this girl. Her name, she told me her name was Susie Chopin. Now I come to find out Chopin is not French, is it? I don't know. But she was beautiful. She was beautiful. Yeah, Chopin, the composer, was Polish. That's right. So, she'd been there. You know, then they'd taken her from France to work in the factories in Germany. But there was a lot of people in that building, and they didn't have enough beds to go around and everything else. And she actually laid down on my cot with me all night. And that's all that happened. And I think that the other guys thought I was crazy, but well, that's the way it was. You know.
So this is so what happens after that? In other words, the end of the war.
Well,
then, what did you do?
Well, here's what then happened. Here we were in Augsburg, and in fact is she wanted to go with us. This young girl wanted to go with us, and I never knew that my company commander was never going to get in that tank again. You know, and I could have put her in the tank, and because we left there and we went to a place called Ostrich, Ostric, up near Rudesheim in Germany, and. No, I take that back. We didn't go. We went to a place called Ebnat, E-B-N-A-T, a small town way up on the top of I call it a mountain, maybe it wasn't a mountain, but certainly a big hill, 5 or 10 miles up in there off the main road. And we stayed there for a couple of months. We must have stayed there from May till into July. And then they started breaking down the 12th Armored Division. And the fact is they called for volunteers for the CBI, for the Pacific, and I volunteered. So they sent me. And I got to Nancy, France, and that's when they dropped the atomic bomb. And then everything was canceled. So I got sent back, and that's when I went to Ostrich, this place up near Rudesheim. I went to the 1st Armored Division. And I went up there, and I stayed with the 1st Armored Division for a couple of months, or let's see, that was must have been in August. And to make a long story short, I was with the 1st Armored Division. I went from the 1st Armored Division to the 36th Infantry Division, and from the 36th Infantry, and I was an MP there, and they didn't like me because I used to drive a Jeep around town, and the division newspaper was the 36th Infantry, which is a Texas division, you know, with a T, and the newspaper came out and said, "Who's the smiling MPs that are driving around town?" You know, so the postmaster said, "You're not an MP." So they sent me. I went to the 100th Division in a town called Schorndorf in Germany, and there I got friendly with a lot of the civilians. You know, it was I felt that I could settle down that town and live there. But then that was by that time we were getting around toward December, and they shipped us to down near Marseille. We were supposed to come home, but they took our boats away from us because the 82nd Airborne Division had to be back in New York City to march in the New Year's Day parade, so they went ahead of us. But anyway, we finally left Marseille, went down through the Straits of Gibraltar, took 18 days on a Liberty ship. It was a Simon Abbott, I think. We went over on the U.S. Marine Raven and came back on the Simon Abbott. Well, it wasn't, I say we, it was a different group coming back because I wasn't with the 12th Armored Division any longer. I had left them in July, and I understand they were disbanded in August. So anyway, we came home to New York City. We went to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey. And from there, they sent us to Fort Dix, and I was discharged on the 1st of February, 1946. So actually, I was only in the Army 3 years, 119 days, something like that. But it seemed like a lifetime, and it's been a lifetime now. You know, it was quite an experience. I don't know what my life would have been without it. And then again, how can you tell? But then I stayed. I stayed in the reserve. I was in the reserve for 12 years. I actually ended up a master sergeant, but in the infantry, 105th Infantry, New York National Guard. And I was the operations sergeant for an infantry battalion. And I liked the military, but then I got involved in politics. They wanted me to take a commission as a second lieutenant. By that time, I was almost 28. I was over age and grade. And I got stacks of papers like that for my commission. I went before the regimental board, And boy, they put me through the ringer, I'll tell you. And so they said, no, we're not going to give you your commission tonight, but you come back in a month and it'll be all right. So come to find out, 2 weeks later, they got rid of our battalion commander in Schenectady where I was going. And then I realized what I was involved in and I got out. I never should have, because 20 years I'd had some kind of a pension coming, so even from the reserve. But then, and I did like the military. And then to top it off, they took the 27th Division, which is New York National Guard, and made an armored division out of it after that, which would have went right down my alley, you know. But I have no regrets for having served in the military, and especially I feel good about the people I come to know. And
well, can you think of anything that we've gone through pretty quickly, a lot of history, a lot of time?
Yeah.
Can you think of anything that you failed to mention, or anything you want to add?
Elaborate on it? Well, I guess the main things that I wanted to, Charles Clayton, our company commander, I'll tell you, I can't say enough good things. Here was a man, I understand he was a graduate from ROTC, Oklahoma, A&M. And he came in the Army, first time I ever met him, he was a captain. And they called him Junior. He could have passed for 18 years old very easy, he might have been 21. And what he led us in combat, I never ever saw him get overly excited or concerned, even when Colonel Field would be calling saying, we got to take that bridge, we got to take that bridge, Clayton, let's get going. He'd say, I got men up here. We're not just machines, I got men. And he said, and he'd do it, whatever, you know. I remember one time this roadblock stopped us, and he was great with maps, and he had a old Army map, and gee, we took an old side track up the side of this mountain around down right behind that roadblock and knocked it out from the back with just us and 2 other tanks. And this was a company commander doing this. He could have sent a platoon sergeant to do that, you know, which probably would have been the right thing to do, but he went with him. He did send a platoon sergeant, but we went with him. We were 3 tanks went around here and we knocked that platoon, then we moved on. And things like that. There's one thing I'd like to emphasize. And he got the Silver Star, and he may have got a 2nd Silver Star. I don't know, he got the Bronze Star, and he deserved every one of them, whatever he got, because he saved a lot of lives in Herlisheim and other times too. Jimmy Phelps, who never graduated from high school, but he was in the Army. When I went in, he was a staff sergeant, and he was a platoon sergeant, and he got a battlefield commission. And for a young man who, you know, wasn't overly educated, but boy, what a job he did. He was at Herlisheim, he was up there in the waterworks, and I know he saved lives up there. And I could name probably a dozen more people that were very outstanding. And Fred Sheldon, also another one of our men, they got a battlefield. We called him Pap, and he was, what, in his early 30s. He's still alive. He's been to, like, 3-4 years ago, we had him at a reunion. And Frank Scaglione. Just good people. Good people. Well, and that's what I wanted to talk about, you know, those things. These are the guys that actually got down there and did the digging, did the work, did the fight, and took the punishment. You can talk about Eisenhower and Patton and all those people, but Patton was a great general. I think he was, for our type of combat, you know, for armor, because if you keep moving armor, you're great. But once you start sitting still with armor, you're a sitting duck. When I was in the National Guard, after when the Korean War was on, I wanted to go to Korea, because I said, with an infantry, give me an infantry platoon and I'll be a match for a tank, because I knew one time there was a bridge in one of these towns, and we stopped. They blew the bridge with the men still setting the charges on that bridge. The Germans blew it because we were only right there. We weren't more than a city block away, not more than 100 yards away from it when they blew it. So we pulled our tank over here, and Frank Bagley, who was my assistant gunner then, jumped down off the tank. After we'd been there a little, we got our little burner out to make coffee and cook up soup. And he went over in the bushes to relieve himself, and all of a sudden I saw him grab him for his back. Here's a kid, about a 14-year-old kid in a foxhole with a Panzerfaust, crying his heart out because he had been told, he had been given a German overcoat, not a uniform, just a German overcoat and a Panzerfaust, and he was told probably shoot a tank if he can. Well, he wasn't 10 feet from our tank, and he could have put a hole right through that tank. But he was just scared to death. And all we did was, we took his overcoat away from him, asked him where he lived, he said down the street, and we sent him home. You know, and things like that, you know, where he could have knocked our tank out. He'd have ended up dead, probably. But, and the war was pretty near over by that time. I guess it was pretty obvious the Germans were going to lose, although maybe that kid didn't know it. But things like that you saw. And so many little incidences. I remember when they were shelling us way back in Bentweiler the first day there. The shells were coming in, and you didn't know where to hide or what to do, you know. If you couldn't line up for a mess call, that's for sure. And but it was 5 months, and I guess those of us that came back were pretty fortunate. Yeah.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.